This is the fifth in the series exploring the 7 Factors of Enlightenment. And in this session, we will discuss the fourth factor. The word in Pali is piti, P-I-T-I, and there's a range of translations which is associated with a variety, a range of ways in which people understand and experience piti. Some of the common translations of piti are rapture, bliss, pleasure, zest, and exuberance. So you can see that there's a different sense with these different terms. So we'll come back and explore that in just a few moments. But first I want to pause here because the feeling or the sense is starting to shift at this stage in the progression of the 7 factors. And it's becoming more concentration, meditation focused. So let's go back and explore and just spend a little time on the first 3 factors. The very first factor is mindfulness, in Pali sati. And mindfulness is foundational for any style of meditation practice. You may or may not be emphasizing the samadhi, the concentration side in your practice. And so even if you're doing some kind of bare mindfulness practices or different kinds of insight meditation or other kind of practices, obviously there's some degree of having the mind be a little more steady, stable, less distracted. But even if you're not putting much emphasis on the deepening of the concentration side, the mindfulness will come into play there. And of course, it's important for the concentration-oriented meditation too. The second factor in Pali was Dhammavichaya, which meant exploration or investigation of experience or a phenomena. And I want to just come back and name a few of the different, some other terms I brought in, which I think help fill out the meaning. So in addition to this word investigation, I also described it as discernment. So investigation is more of an active process, and then discernment is the quality of understanding or experiencing or knowing clearly whatever it is happening. And then I brought in a couple of other terms which are not part of the list, but I think they're used a lot in the Pali texts, and I think they help fill out the meaning of the Dhammavichaya here. One of the terms is translated in English as clear comprehension, and it's often used paired up with mindfulness. You'll hear mindfulness and clear comprehension, that phrase, a lot. They aren't exactly the same thing, but they're closely related. The word that's translated as clear comprehension in Pali, sampajanya. And so mindfulness is just knowing what's happening in the moment, not being spaced out or caught up in things. I described it as not being lost on automatic pilot. That was my definition of the state of mindfulness. And the practice of mindfulness, of course, is directing that mindful attention in various ways. Through being present, then we have a clear understanding, this clear comprehension of what's going on. So I think that also is a sense of the meaning here with Dhammavichaya in this second factor in this list. And then another term I use, which is a long Pali term, and again, you don't need to know the Pali. I'm just giving them here because some people may be interested in that. It's Yoniso Manasikara, and it just means wise attention or appropriate attention. And again, it's more of this act like an investigation of how we direct our awareness or our intention. So I think all these terms help fill out the meaning of what is being got at here in the second factor. So we have mindfulness, investigation, and then last time we talked about the third factor, which is energy. The word in Pali is virya. And there were 2 aspects there. We want to bring that discernment and that clear knowing, clear awareness, to be aware of how is our energy when we're meditating. We don't want to spend a lot of time overthinking it or having to keep looking, but from time to time we check in. Or as our mind becomes more steady and clear, we just naturally know when the energy's too low or when it's too high, right? If it's too low, we can be dull, sleepy, where we lack that very clarity that we're aiming for. So then we need to have various ways to work, and we discussed this last time, of how can we help bring the energy up, brighten the mind. Conversely, sometimes we have too much energy and we're too restless in the mind or the body. The mind's too stirred up, in the body we're too restless. And then we need to have the tools. How can we help bring down the energy, dissipate some of the energy? And again, we talked about some of the main tips and things you can try for that, right? All of these three qualities, the mindfulness, the investigation, and the energy, come to play, again, even if you're not emphasizing the concentration side of the practice, but they come to play even in pure mindfulness or insight type practices. In the context of the 7 Factors of Enlightenment, we're specifically bringing them to play in service of bringing to fruition or developing all the 7 factors. And so that means they're in service of deepening on the concentration side. And so as you'll see, starting with this next factor, piti, this is really associated with the deepening, the steadying of the mind, and the deepening, dropping in more deeply into the meditation. And it will carry through, as we'll see, in some of the later factors also. So anyone who has spent much time meditating, you may have experienced this yourself. When the mind starts even a little bit to steady, you just feel yourself deepening, or it's hard to describe it, but at some point, if you're newer to meditation, you may not have experienced this yet, but at some point you will feel yourself be a little deeper in. The mind's not as scattered. It's not jumping around all over the place. You really have a sense of presence, calm, steadiness, quiet, stillness. There's a lot of different forms it can take. But you'll know I feel a little deeper in than I am, say, in ordinary daily life consciousness. The concentration, the samadhi piece is deepening, and it is pleasant. It feels good. So even that is it may not be that strong, but even this light pleasantness, that's the beginning of this piti, is you're experiencing it right there and right then. And then as you continue to deepen, the piti can strengthen. It doesn't mean that you will never experience anything unpleasant again. Sure, we can have difficulties coming up in the mind or the body, but as the piti comes into play, that can be in there with us to help support the practice. So for some people, and this is very important, the way piti manifests is highly individual. In the Pali texts, in the original source text, what we call the Pali Suttas, the original teachings, the word piti is never defined. It's used a lot, but it goes undefined. In the days when, the early days, when these teachings and texts were being formulated, there were probably shared understandings of what was meant. And it turns out that how it is experienced, how it is experienced varies tremendously, and has nothing to do with how deeply concentrated you are. For some people, this piti can become very intense, and for some people, it's very light. I should also mention that there is a later text in the Theravada tradition. It's a long Pali name. It starts with a V, Visuddhimagga. It's translated as Path of Purification. It's not a commentary, but it's based on the commentarial texts and understanding that arose in the centuries, 5, 6, 7, 800 years after the Buddha. We don't know the exact dates. And it's a treatise based on the commentarial understanding. And in that text, PT is described in a lot of detail, and these very clear descriptions are given. So a lot of people will tell you this is what PT is supposed to be based on that text, and those descriptions are an accurate description of how PT is experienced by some people, but a lot of people it's just not that way. Most of the descriptions in that Visuddhimagga text are of a very powerful kind of PT. So what are the ways that it can manifest when it's very strong? It can be in the body, and it can feel like an energy moving and flowing in the body. It can be a very pleasant, we could say blissful energy flowing in the body, and it feels good when that happens. But it can get very strong to the point where it feels like too much, and then it's not experienced as pleasant. It actually will turn and be actually kind of unpleasant. In addition to the strength, it can qualitatively it's experienced differently. For some people, it can be very smooth, even if it's very strong, and for others, they'll describe it as being kind of a jarring or raggedy kind of feeling, or jagged. And so that can be very unpleasant. And I'll say something in a few minutes about some of the ways we can work with that. That's a big topic, but basically it can be worked with. So it can be very, very strong in the body, or it can just be a light sense of pleasantness. Other times, people don't experience it in the body. Maybe you would say it's mental. It's not so clear that if it's located in any particular place, but there just is an experience of pleasantness. Again, it could be strong, or it can be more light. And again, it's very, very important. Some people think that, when you're in the deeper stages of concentration, it's supposed to be some particular way. There is no way it's supposed to be. And it's what's important is how is it for you? Having said that, as we'll see when we get to a couple of more of the factors, the one on samadhi, which is the states of concentration, the deeper meditative states. The deeper stages of samadhi, they begin when you with this piti, but at some point we deepen and the piti settles out. It wants to settle out because whether it's intense or light, we want to go to a more stillness and just more of a clear, bright, pure consciousness or mind. And so the piti can get lighter and lighter and settle out anyway. It's common for people to judge their meditation by how much piti they have. And people will often come into, when you're on, say, meditation retreats, or even in daily life, times when I'm sometimes working with people about discussing their meditation practice with them, they'll report on their piti. And that's fine to do that, but just to be aware that that's one marker of what's going on, one description of what's going on, but it's not really, again, it's not necessarily directly related with how deeply concentrated you are. So we just notice how is the piti for us. By the way, I mentioned that it can be very strong and powerful. This is a way in which it can be connected with the last factor we did, the virya, the energy, because the piti can have a very energetic quality. So again, you'll just notice how it is for you. And the piti can have it's just a manifestation of just the nature of being more concentrated, but also we can use it and work with it because it can want to bring us more deeply, more fully into the meditation. It's like it wants to pull us in, or we want to just go, or merge is kind of a funny word, but kind of go into it, be pulled into it more deeply. Immerse in it is probably a better word. And so we can use that quality of the piti to help draw us in more deeply. And some meditation teachers will say that when the pleasant starts to come pretty early on in the practice, they will give the instruction to let go of whatever your meditation object you were working with before. Say you were working with mindfulness of your breath. They would tell you, let go of the breath and now put your attention on the pleasant experience itself, on the piti, as the new meditation object. And to let that bring you more deeply in. That does work for some people, so you'll have to see for yourself. For a lot of people, well, just one thing to be aware of, if you turn your attention away from the breath too soon and go kind of on the early side to connecting with the piti, if you've let go of the breath too soon, you'll know, because when you switch over to the piti, you'll feel yourself lifting out. The mind won't be as steady. It'll be a little more stirred up. You'll just won't be as deep. And then you'll know, oh, I let go of the breath too soon, and I really need to come back and stay with the breath more. The piti will still be in there, but you'll give some preference or predominance to the breath itself, and stay with it longer. And then at some point, you can experiment again as it gets stronger and stronger, if you want to consciously shift to the piti. And you'll know if the time is right or if you should stay with your main meditation object. Regardless of how you work with this, at some point, even if you don't consciously turn towards the piti as an object, at some point, the piti will come in and be kind of blended with your experience of your breath. It becomes more strong within whatever other meditation practices you're there. It gets blended in. So you might experience, for example, your breath, but it becomes a very pleasant or blissful breath. The piti's in there with the breath, for example. So you don't have to experiment with letting go of the object. You could just stay with your breath and just watch it as it unfolds. And that's a way that you can work with it. So, and you can notice how it wants to pull you in. I should also mention that you may hear some teachers, especially those who identify as insight teachers, depending on the teacher, they may de-emphasize the concentration side, and they'll say, oh, be careful, you're going to get attached or cling to the pleasant. And first of all, I should point out, let me see if I can find this. I'm going to read a quote, just one moment here, from the Buddha, attributed to the Buddha in the Pali texts. Sorry, just a moment here. If I can, I should have had a bookmarker on here. And this is, we don't know when they attribute things, put words in the mouth of the Buddha, did he really say it or not? But certainly the Theravada tradition upholds this. If it's attributing it to the Buddha, this is what it says. So there's these particular states of meditation called jhana. Don't worry if you haven't heard that. I'll mention it more when we get into a couple more factors in samadhi. This state's called jhana, but they're getting pretty deep. The Buddha says jhana is called the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of enlightenment. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should be pursued, that it should be developed, that it should be cultivated, that it should not be feared. So certainly the Buddha was not one to tell you to watch out, be careful. I should say that probably when you get to these meditative states in this piti, I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me just say this. Everybody can meditate to a point where they start to feel this happening. Some people do it through daily life practice. For many people, it's more they'll need to be in a meditation retreat context. But everybody, if you have the interest and you give it enough priority, now you may need to speak with some teachers or get some help in your practice, and we can all use help from time to time. But this is something that is open and available that everybody can experience. It feels really good. It's quite pleasant, and you probably will have some craving after it or some level of clinging or attachment. This is very common. And yes, if we're clinging, it's a potential setup for suffering. But we just know that that can happen. Who wouldn't want more of these states? They do feel really good. They're very freeing, they're liberating, they're just healing in the body and in the mind. There's a lot of benefits to these pleasant states. And when we lose them and you're clinging or craving after it, yes, it is a setup for suffering there. And then we learn. So it's very common for people to chase after these states and to cling to them and just to know that that can happen. And then we learn how to let go and shift the practice more from having to have any particular experience to just opening and being present with whatever it is that actually is happening in the present moment, including when you can't concentrate, when there isn't any piti, when it can be challenging and difficult. And then the only question is, sometimes when those things happen, people think something's going wrong or the meditation's kind of falling apart. But nothing's going wrong. It just changed. It's always changing, and there's always ups and downs, no matter how far you take your meditation. And so we learn to let the present moment teach us, and then rather than craving after the piti, we just know there's something else happening right now. What will help me? How can I work most skillfully with this unpleasantness in my body or whatever's going on mentally or emotionally or spiritually, psychically? So in that way, we'll learn with time to chase after the piti less and less. And then the other thing is when we are craving after something, we're not as relaxed and easeful, and we tend to be more tight and constricted and conflicted. And that is really the way to have less and less samadhi, because the deeper stages are stages of letting go. They're not states of gaining or getting. So I'm getting a little bit into the topic on samadhi, which we'll explore later, but just a little bit to encourage you to not worry. You can want these pleasant states, and you should want them. It's part of the practice. So we don't have to pretend that we don't want them. We simply have to aim ourselves in a skillful way, in a wholesome way, without making them an object of craving and clinging and chasing after them. That's the trick. And for most of us, that takes some time, and so we'll develop the ability and the skills as time goes on. Just one more piece I want to add in this session, which is a few things to keep in mind if the PT, I had mentioned earlier that it can get to feel like it's too much. Just a few simple things you can do. Sometimes just using our breathing to help calm and settle and just mentally bring a feeling of breathing out the excess energy can help. Sometimes we just mentally feel that we're kind of draining it out our arms and legs, or if we're sitting in a chair or cross-legged on a cushion where our body's pressing against the seat, we can just feel that groundedness and it's just sort of a mental trick or a mental feeling to let it drain away. Also, if it's difficult, you can always just end the meditation and get up, and as you open your eyes or move around, it will settle back out. So don't worry, you're not going to get into a place where you're not able to work with it. So I think that's enough for now. Gives it a basic overview of PT. Again, these are all big topics because in the course of a lifetime of meditation, there's a lot of experiences that can happen, and so we learn with time. But hopefully, for now, that's enough just for an overview.